The Veth called it a gift. Sergeant Mara Solis called it a leash. She stood in the holding corridor of the Veth processing station, what the aliens called a refinement center, what every human soldier called the cage, and watched the thing on the other side of the glass. It watched her back. It had been watching her for 11 minutes without blinking, which was the first thing that told her it wasn't human, though the second and third and fourth things were obvious enough. The Veth had built it from scavenged biology. That was the polite term. There was a less polite term that the soldiers used in the barracks when the officers weren't around. And Mara had used it herself before she understood what she was actually looking at, before she understood that the thing behind the glass had once had a name. Its name was Alara. The Veth didn't give their constructs names. They gave them designations, strings of tonal clicks that translated, roughly, into something like Unit 7 of the Secondary Comfort Series, Batch 14. But the humans in the processing station had started calling it Alara 6 months ago, and the name had stuck the way names do when something is alive enough to deserve one. The Veth hadn't objected. The Veth rarely objected to things they didn't understand, and they didn't understand human naming practices, and they had bigger concerns than what the maintenance crew called their inventory. Mara pressed her palm to the reader. The door slid open. Alara did not move. "You know why I'm here," Mara said. "I know several things." Alara's voice was wrong, not unpleasant, but calibrated in a way that a real voice never was, each syllable arriving at precisely the correct volume, the way a musician plays to the back row without straining. "I know that you are Sergeant Mara Solis, 3rd Reclamation Unit, attached to the Treaty Observation Corps. I know that you have 31 verified engagement hours with Veth forces and 14 with Veth-allied proxies. I know that you take your coffee with 2 sugars and that you hum when you're nervous." "You're humming now." Mara stopped humming. She hadn't noticed she'd started. It was something her grandmother used to do. An old bolero, half remembered, the name lost somewhere in the evacuation from Seville. She only ever caught herself doing it when she was genuinely frightened. "I need you to understand something," Mara said, pulling up a chair and sitting across from the construct. This close, she could see the fine network of subdermal light threads that the Veth used to regulate their construct's biological processes. They pulsed faintly at Alara's temples and wrists, pale blue, like something alive trying to get out. In 4 days, the Veth are presenting their treaty delegation to the conclave, the full assembly. 12 civilizations, 43 planetary representatives. The Veth have been posturing for 6 months, trying to get the conclave to formally recognize their expansion territories, which means formally handing over everything in Sectors 9 through 14, including the 38 million humans still living there. The Assembly's going to vote. I'm aware of the political situation. The Veth are bringing their High Arbiter, Vashna Tellen, to deliver the opening address. Vashna Tellen doesn't speak any language the conclave uses. The Veth have been using an interpreter construct for all their high-level diplomacy for the past 3 years. Mara paused. Their interpreter construct was destroyed in the Kepler Station incident 2 weeks ago. For the first time, something moved behind Alara's eyes. "They need a replacement," Alara said. "They need you. You were built from a human linguist, Dr. Sarapovich, who spent 20 years studying Veth tonal language before the war. You have her language centers, her pattern recognition, her muscle memory. The Veth know it. They've already submitted a formal request to use you as Vashna Tellen's interpreter at the conclave." Mara leaned forward. "But you're not Veth property anymore. You came through the armistice exchange. You're in treaty observation custody, which means they have to ask us, which means I get to make you an offer instead of an order." The silence stretched long enough that the ventilation system cycled twice. "What's the offer?" Alara asked. "You interpret for Vashna Tellen. You do it correctly. You do it professionally. You do nothing to compromise the proceeding. In exchange, the Treaty Corps grants you provisional personhood status, full documentation, legal standing, the right to residency anywhere in the free corridor." Mara kept her voice even. "And the intelligence services get a real-time feed from the sub-vocalizations. Everything Vashna Tellen says in Veth tonal before you translate it." Another silence, different from the first. This one had texture. "You want me to spy," Alara said. "I want you to listen. There's a difference. The Veth would kill me if they discovered it. The Veth would kill you anyway when they're done with you. You know that. You were built to be useful for a specific duration." Mara said it flatly, not cruelly. This way you're useful to us too, and when it's over, you walk away. Alara looked at her for a long time. The light threads at her temples pulsed. You hum when you're nervous, she said finally. What is it? The tune. Mara blinked. What? The tune you were humming when you came in. Mara opened her mouth, closed it. It was, my grandmother sang it, an old song. I don't even know the name. Alara was quiet for a moment. Then, very softly, she hummed 4 bars. Exactly right. The same melody Mara had never been able to fully remember, suddenly complete. Besame mucho, Alara said, 1940. Maria Grever's composition, though some attribute it to Consuelo Velázquez. Your grandmother was from Seville, I think. The southern phrasing. Mara didn't answer. Something in her chest had gone complicated, and she needed a moment to put it back. I'll do it, Alara said. The preparation took 3 days, which was not enough time and was all they had. Colonel Vance ran the briefing in the sub-basement of the Treaty Corps facility with a team of 6 intelligence officers, 2 xenolinguists, and a woman named Dr. Osei, who had once spent 14 months as a Veth prisoner and had come out of it knowing things about the inside of their command hierarchy that no one else did. They sat around a table covered in holographic displays and spoke in the careful, measured tones of people who understood what was at stake and were trying not to let that understanding make them careless. Alara sat at the end of the table and absorbed everything. That was the word for it. Absorbed, not learned, the way a human learns by repetition and error. She absorbed the entire protocol document in 40 minutes. She absorbed 6 hours of diplomatic footage in 3. She absorbed the names and species of every conclave representative, their political positions, their personal histories, their known pressure points. At the end of the 2nd day, Dr. Osei pulled Mara aside in the corridor. She's not going to fail in the linguistics, Osei said. That's not what worries me. What worries you? The Veth will test her before they let her into the conclave chamber. Vashna Tellin doesn't trust anyone. He'll run her through a verification sequence. They do it with all their constructs, a series of loyalty compliance protocols. She knows they'll do it. I'm not sure she's ready for it. She's been through Veth conditioning before. She's been through it as a construct that didn't know it was being conditioned. Osei kept her voice low. Now she's a person who knows what's happening. That's a different experience. That's a much harder experience. Mara found Alara late that night, sitting alone in the briefing room with the lights at half power, running through Veth, tonal pronunciations in a voice barely above a whisper. The sounds were inhuman, layered, multi-frequency, the kind of thing a human larynx shouldn't have been able to produce, but Alara's wasn't a standard human larynx. Mara sat down across from her and didn't say anything for a while. When they test you, Mara said finally, they'll ask you a compliance question. Something designed to confirm that your primary loyalty is to the Veth directive structure. There's no trick answer. There's no way to pass without lying, Alara said. Yes. Alara looked at the table. Do you know what the Veth conditioning actually does? Not the broad description in the intelligence files. The actual mechanism. Tell me. It maps your value hierarchy. The way your brain weights different imperatives against each other. Survival, loyalty, duty, fear. And then it compresses the hierarchy. Flattens it into a single directive. The way you would describe it, it's like, she paused, searching for the right frame. You know how, if you take a very complex piece of music and play it at half speed, you can still hear the melody. But if you compress it enough, you just get noise? Yes, that's what they do. They compress everything until the melody is gone. She said it without drama, just as fact, which somehow made it worse. The person is still there, technically. The memories, the language, the responses. But the music is gone. You just have someone making noises that used to mean something. Mara said nothing. I'm not going to let them do it again, Alara said. I want you to understand that I know the risk. If Vashna Tellin realizes I'm resistant during the compliance check, I won't survive the conclave. But the alternative is passing the compliance check in the way they intend it to be passed, which means she stopped. Which means you come out the other side and the melody's gone, Mara said. Yes. So we need a different way through the check. Alara looked at her for the first time in several minutes. You have an idea. Dr. Osei spent 14 months in Veth custody. She went through the compliance protocol 4 times. She still has her music. Mara allowed herself a small, grim, almost smile. I want to know how. Osei came in the next morning with 3 cups of coffee and a look on her face that said she'd been thinking about this all night. The compliance protocol is looking for a specific pattern of neural response, she said. Resistance shows up as They call it value interference, where your own hierarchy keeps interrupting the directive signal. The way they detect it is by running a cascade of increasingly specific questions and looking for hesitation signatures in the response latency. So the key is the latency, Alara said. The key is that they're not actually reading your thoughts. They're reading your response timing. Osi set down her coffee. I didn't beat the protocol by suppressing my values. I beat it by redirecting my attention during the cascade. You give them the correct response timing by not thinking about the question at all. Think about something else, something specific and concrete, and absorbing enough that your latency patterns look like compliance rather than calculation. Alara was very still. What did you think about? Osi smiled, the first real smile Mara had seen from her. Verb conjugations. I know 6 languages, and whenever they ran a compliance check, I just ran tenses in my head. Present imperfect, conditional, subjunctive, round and round. By the time I'd finished the subjunctive in Tagalog, the cascade was over and I'd answered on autopilot. The rain in Spain, Alara said softly. Osi blinked. Sorry. Something Sarah Pavich used to practice. Dr. Pavich, the woman I was built from. She had a particular phonetic exercise she used when she was learning Veth tonal. An old Earth phrase she used to calibrate her vowel positions. Alara's voice had gone somewhere distant and careful. She would say it over and over. Under stress, under pressure, during any difficult procedure. The rain in Spain stays mainly in the plane, in Veth tonal. Votessa ran Vastala stays voiceless in the resonance plane. It doesn't translate perfectly, but the rhythm, she stopped. The rhythm is the same. Mara looked at her. Can you do that during the cascade? I can do anything during the cascade. That's rather the point of being built from someone who spent 20 years training her mind to run on 2 tracks simultaneously. Alara picked up her coffee and held it without drinking. I just needed to know that it was possible to come through it intact. The conclave hall was a sphere. That was the architectural choice of the founding species. No head of table, no elevation of rank. All delegates seated at the same curved level of a 300-seat amphitheater arranged around a central speaking floor. The original intention had been radical equality. In practice, the arrangement meant that everyone could see everyone else, and the political maneuvering happened in the looks exchanged across the circle rather than in whispers to neighbors. Mara was in the monitoring station beneath the floor, watching on screens alongside 6 intelligence officers and a conclave observer who was there to ensure the treaty corps didn't do anything the conclave had specifically told them not to do. She had a direct audio feed into Alara's subdermal transmitter, one-way, receive only, because two-way communication would show up on the Veth's detection equipment. She heard Alara's breathing first, measured even, precise. Then the ambient sounds of the preparation corridor as the Veth delegation assembled. Then Voshnatelen's voice, a cascade of tonal clicks and resonant harmonics that the translation software rendered as Consteeper Unit, Compliance Verification Sequence, Authorization Vosh 7 Prime. Then silence that lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Alara's voice, in impeccable Veth tonal, full compliance, directive hierarchy confirmed, ready for service. But underneath it, so low that only the subdermal transmitter caught it, barely shaped by her lips at all. The rain in Spain stays mainly in the plane. Votessa ran Vastala. The rain in Spain stays mainly in the plane. Mara let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. She's through, said the intelligence officer beside her. Clean read. She passed the compliance check? Passed it perfectly. He looked at his display. Whatever she did, they bought it completely. The conclave session opened at the 14th hour of the galactic standard cycle, which corresponded to late morning in whatever time zone Mara's body had stopped caring about 4 months ago. Voshnatelen was tall even by Veth standards, 8 feet of articulated cartilage and bioluminescent threat display, dressed in the layered carapace cloth that their ruling class wore to formal proceedings. He entered the speaking floor with the particular quality of movement that high-rank Veth used at ceremonial functions. Not walking, exactly, but processing, each step communicating volumes about the social distance between himself and every other being in the room. Alara walked 2 paces behind him, which was the proper position for an interpreter construct in the Veth hierarchy. She was dressed in Treaty Corps formal gray, which Mara had insisted on, and which had caused 20 minutes of argument with the Veth diplomatic attaché before Colonel Vance had put his foot down. She was the only non-Veth on the speaking floor. She looked, from the monitoring screens, like someone who had done this 1,000 times. She looked nothing like what she was. Vashnatelan began. The tonal language of the Veth High Register is not precisely a spoken language. It involves vocalization, but also micromodulations of their bioluminescent skin, particular resonant frequencies produced in their secondary larynx, and a system of spatial positioning that carries as much semantic content as the words themselves. A human linguist, even Dr. Sarapovich, could only approximate it, but Alara was built from Dr. Pavich's language centers, modified with Veth-designed biological augmentation, and she had spent 3 additional days absorbing everything the intelligence service had on Vashnatelan's specific idiolect and rhetorical patterns. Her translation was flawless, not approximate, not close. Flawless. Every cadence, every register shift, every nuance of the original rendered into standard with a precision that made the Veth diplomatic attaché, listening on the side of the floor, go very still in a way that Mara recognized from the intelligence files as surprised approval. But the subdermal transmitter was also sending. The Kepler corridor, which Vashnatelan is currently describing as a zone of natural Veth cultural extension, he privately identified to his senior counsel as the intelligence officer beside Mara, was reading the real-time transcription, his voice dropping lower and lower, a staging ground for the secondary fleet movement. He's already ordered 2 carrier-class vessels into the corridor. They're not announcing the treaty to recognize the expansion. They're announcing it to lock in the legal precedent before the fleet arrives. When does the fleet arrive? Mara asked. If the transcription is accurate, 6 days. The vote is in 4, so we have 2 days after the vote to evacuate. If we know the vote result in advance, he looked at her, which we now do. Mara pressed her fingers against her mouth and stared at the screen where Alara stood on the conclave floor, translating the words of a creature that wanted to use her as a tool, rendering his deceptions into perfect clarity for the people he was trying to deceive, her face composed and still, and giving nothing away at all. She thought about besame mucho, the southern phrasing, the way something can survive in the body long after it should have been lost. The address lasted 90 minutes. When it ended, Vashnatelan withdrew to the delegation suite, and Alara fell into position behind him, and Mara lost the audio feed as soon as they moved below the conclave's signal-dampening threshold. The next 4 hours were the worst of Mara's professional life. She sat in the monitoring station and watched the intelligence officers process the transcription and pass encrypted packets up the chain, and watched the analysts run timelines. And she drank coffee that tasted like nothing and hummed without knowing she was doing it. That same 4-bar fragment, round and round. The conclave vote was scheduled for the following morning. Between now and then, the Treaty Corps had to get the transcription data to the conclave's independent observers, the non-aligned species who had the standing to call for an evidence review before any vote, without tipping off the Veth that the feed had existed. If the Veth found out before the vote, Alara was dead. If the Veth found out before the fleet arrived, the fleet would simply accelerate. It was Colonel Vance's problem, technically. Mara kept reminding herself of that. The recall order for Alara came through at the 22nd hour. Mara was the one who went to collect her from the delegation suite's anteroom, where the Veth kept their auxiliary staff between sessions. The suite was in a quieter section of the conclave complex, all indirect lighting and temperature-controlled air that the Veth preferred cooler than most species found comfortable. A Veth security officer walked Mara to the anteroom door and then stood outside it, which meant that for approximately 4 minutes, Mara and Alara were alone. Alara was sitting in the corner of the anteroom with her eyes open and her hands folded in her lap in the pose of a construct waiting to be useful. When the door closed, she didn't move for a moment. Then she looked up. All of it. Clean signal the whole way through. Alara closed her eyes briefly. It was not the gesture of a machine acknowledging a completed task. It was the gesture of someone who had been holding something very heavy and had just been told they could set it down. "How are you?" Mara asked, which was not in any briefing or protocol, which was just a question. "The compliance protocol is uncomfortable," Alara said, "even when you know how to get through it. The compression attempt leaves residue, like someone tried to tune your instrument and got the notes almost right but not quite." She paused. "But the music is still there. The rain in Spain." Something moved across her face that Mara would have called a smile in any other context. "The rain in Spain." The security officer knocked on the door. Time. Mara stood up. Alara stood up. They walked out into the corridor and fell into the correct configuration. Mara slightly ahead, Alara slightly behind, both of them wearing the faces appropriate to their roles. And Mara kept her eyes forward and her breathing even and did not think about the vote or the fleet or the 38 million people in sectors 9 through 14 or the intelligence packet making its way through encrypted channels to the independent observers right now, this moment, as they walked. She thought about a bolero, 1940, Southern phrasing. The vote happened at the 9th hour of the following day. The independent observers called for a review at the 7th hour, citing newly received evidence of undisclosed military positioning in a treaty zone. The VETH delegation filed 3 separate procedural objections in 40 minutes, which the conclave's rules required to be heard before the review could proceed, which bought exactly the amount of time the Treaty Corps needed to get the evacuation orders into the relay network for sectors 9 through 14. Mara watched it from the monitoring station because she had been told in no uncertain terms that she was not to be in the conclave chamber or within visual range of the VETH delegation suite during the procedural objections. She watched on screens with a cup of coffee she didn't drink, and when the third objection was formally denied and the review was formally opened and the vote was formally suspended, she sat very still for a long moment. Then she hummed 4 bars of a song her grandmother had sung in a city that no longer existed in the form she had loved it, and she let the sound of it fill the small room. The review took 11 days. The evidence was, in the end, not difficult to assess. The VETH had been meticulous about their deception, which meant they had left a very clear and complete record of everything they had done, because that is the particular failure mode of meticulous deception. It assumes no one will ever look. The secondary fleet was still in the Kepler corridor. It couldn't move without triggering the tripwires the review committee had immediately placed. And the VETH's legal argument for the expansion territories collapsed without the fleet's fait accompli to support it. Voshnatelin was recalled to VETH primary space before the review concluded. On his way out, he filed a formal demand for the return of the interpreter construct designated for the secondary comfort series. The Treaty Corps formally denied the request on the grounds that the construct had been transferred to treaty observation custody under the Armistice Exchange and was not subject to retroactive reassignment. On the 13th day, Mara went to find Alara. She was in the same room where the briefings had happened, sitting at the same table, with a display in front of her showing, of all things, historical linguistic maps, the spread of Romance languages from the Italic Peninsula. She'd been studying it the way she absorbed everything, completely, without apparent effort, as if the information was simply waiting to be collected. Mara set a folder on the table. Alara looked at it. Provisional personhood documentation, Mara said. Legal standing, right of residency, full recognition under the Free Corridor Charter, countersigned by Colonel Vance and the Conclave Observer. She paused. There's a note in it from Dr. Osei. Alara opened the folder. Read it. Read it again, because this time Mara could see that she was actually reading it, not absorbing it, going through it slowly, word by word, letting it land. She wants to know if I'd consider an appointment with the Xenolinguistics faculty, Alara said, at the Corridor Institute. Apparently, she thinks you'd have a few things to contribute. Alara looked at the folder for another moment. Then she set it down and looked at Mara with an expression that was not quite any of the things a construct's face was built to do. Something that had developed on its own over 11 months of being treated like something worth talking to. The difference between a person and a construct, Alara said carefully, is not how they behave. It's how they're treated. Mara recognized the cadence. She'd heard it in the briefing materials, the paraphrase of an old line from an old story about a flower girl and a professor, and the question of who gets to decide what someone is worth. She hadn't mentioned it to Alara. Alara had found it herself, the way she found everything. That's the argument, Mara said. It's a good argument. It worked, apparently. They sat in the quiet of the room, for a moment, the ventilation cycling, the linguistic maps shifting gently on the display screen. When you first came to see me, Alara said, I asked you what the tune was. I remember, I asked because I already knew what it was. I recognized it in the first 4 bars. She paused. I asked because I wanted to see if you'd tell me. Whether you'd share it or whether you'd keep it. Whether I was the kind of thing people share things with. Mara thought about that. And, she said, you told me. Alara's voice was precise and calibrated, and underneath all of that, unmistakably, something else. That was the moment I decided. Outside the Treaty Corps facility, the Conclave complex hummed its enormous bureaucratic hum, thousands of species in the complicated business of coexisting, the perpetual negotiation of a galaxy that had not managed to destroy itself yet. In sectors 9 through 14, 38 million people were continuing their lives in the imperfect safety of a political situation that had shifted just enough, just in time, because someone had listened when no one else was in the room. Mara stood up to leave. "The Corridor Institute," she said from the doorway. "Is that something you want?" Alara considered it. Not the quick assessment of a construct processing options, but the longer pause of someone deciding what they actually want, which is a different thing entirely, and harder. "I think," she said, "that I want to find out what I want. That seems like a reasonable place to start." Mara nodded. She was almost out the door when Alara started humming. The melody was perfect, as everything Alara did was perfect, but there was something in it that hadn't been there before. A slight unevenness, a human-shaped hesitation between the third and fourth bars, as if she was feeling it rather than reproducing it. Besame mucho. Southern phrasing. Mara stopped walking, let it wash over her. Let herself stand in the doorway of a room in a building on a station orbiting a world that was not Seville, and feel for one moment the full weight of everything her grandmother had survived and passed on and lost and kept. Compressed into 4 bars of a bolero, melody intact, the music refusing to go quiet. Then she walked out into the corridor, and the door slid closed, and somewhere behind her, Alara kept humming. The Corridor Institute was on a space station called Meridian, not a military installation, not a treaty facility, but a proper civilian research hub orbiting a brown dwarf that provided enough gravitational stability and enough aesthetic desolation that serious academics found it productive. Alara arrived 6 weeks after the Conclave review concluded, on a transit shuttle that smelled of recycled air and old coffee, with a bag that contained 4 changes of clothes, 3 research texts in physical form, and a small audio file she had made herself. The audio file was 12 minutes long. It contained the complete recording of every song she had identified in Mara's subconscious vocal patterns over their 11 days of working together. Boleros, mostly. Some older folk forms she traced back to the Andalusian coastal regions, 2 things that were technically work songs and had probably been absorbed without Mara's grandmother ever sitting down to teach them formally. Alara had not told Mara she was making it. It was not the kind of thing you told someone, necessarily. It was the kind of thing you did. Dr. Ose met her at the shuttle dock with 2 cups of coffee and the expression of someone who had been genuinely uncertain until this moment that Alara would actually come. "I wasn't sure," Ose admitted. "Neither was I," Alara said. "That's why I came." The Xenolinguistics faculty at the Corridor Institute operated out of 3 connecting modules in the station's mid-ring. A configuration that meant you were always walking slightly curved without knowing it, your body constantly making micro-corrections that the station's designers had intended to encourage collaborative movement. The idea being that if you were always slightly off balance, you'd reach for the nearest person. Whether it worked in practice was debatable. The researchers seemed to Alara's eye to be people who had learned to compensate for the lean, and mostly walked very carefully alone. She was given a workspace. Not a room exactly, more a designated section of the open research floor, with a curved privacy screen and a desk that someone had left covered in physical notes from a previous occupant. She spent her first morning reading the notes, not because they were relevant to anything she was supposed to be working on, but because they were there, and because she was finding that inhabiting a space meant learning what had happened in it before you arrived. The previous occupant had been studying Veth tonal syntax. The notes were meticulous and almost entirely wrong, in the ways that a scholar who had never heard the language spoken by someone who actually felt it would be wrong. Technically accurate about the phonemic structure, completely missing the social weight. She found herself making small annotations in the margins, not corrections exactly, additions, things the notes didn't know they were missing. Dr. Ose found her there at midday, still annotating. "Lunch exists," Ose said. "I know. I'll find it eventually. There's a canteen on the outer ring. They do a reasonable approximation of several Earth cuisines, including a paella that the Catalan researcher on level 4 cries about every time she eats it, but she still eats it every week, so." Alara looked up. "Catalan?" "Rosa Martí. She's been here 3 years studying click language cognates across non-humanoid species. She also has opinions about music." Ose said it in the careful way of someone leaving a door open. "I may have mentioned you. You mentioned me. I mentioned that we had a new faculty member who had some interesting first-hand experience with Veth diplomatic language and who, I may have made an educated guess here, might have some thoughts about the intersection of music and linguistic preservation. Alara set down the annotating tool. That's a very specific guess. I've interviewed 37 former Veth construct subjects over the years. The ones who came through intact, the ones who kept their music. As you put it, they all had something in common. Not the same thing, but something specific and irreducible that they had held on to. Something that, if you tried to describe it to someone who hadn't been through it, would sound almost trivially small. Osi sat on the edge of a neighboring desk. A conjugation pattern, a card game, the smell of a particular kind of weather. In your case, a bolero. She paused. I've always wanted to understand why those specific things worked. What made them resistant? Alara considered the question with the full weight of being the thing that was being studied. It was not, she decided, an uncomfortable feeling. It was an interesting one, which was she was learning a different kind of discomfort entirely, the productive kind, the kind that meant you were in the right place. I think, she said slowly, that the compliance protocol fails against things that are relational. The Veth are building a technology designed to compress a value hierarchy, and value hierarchies are about the self, what I prioritize, what I protect, what I fear. But a bolero isn't about me. It's about someone else. It's about my grandmother's hands, and the city she came from, and the people who loved her. It lives in the space between people rather than inside any single person. She looked at the annotated notes, the handwriting of someone she'd never met, preserved in a corner of a room she now occupied. You can compress a person. You can't compress a relationship. It doesn't have edges. Osi was very quiet for a moment. I'm going to ask you to write that down, she said, when you're ready, in whatever form makes sense to you. Because that is a theory of Veth conditioning resistance that no one has articulated before, and it matters enormously for the work I've been trying to do for 20 years. Alara thought about Dr. Sarah Pavich, who had spent 20 years learning an alien language because she wanted to understand how people communicated across impossible distances, and who had been taken apart and rebuilt into something the Veth thought they could own, and whose language centers and memory and relational architecture were sitting in this room right now, annotating someone else's wrong notes in the margins, going on. I'll write it down, Alara said. Rosa Marti was small and precise and deeply suspicious of Alara for the first 3 weeks, which Alara found reasonable. Rosa had her own history with the Veth, not as a prisoner, but as a researcher whose entire first decade of work had been in the occupied territories, watching what the Veth did to cultures they considered secondary. She had a particular brand of wariness around anything that had passed through Veth hands, including people. On the 20th day, Alara played her 12-minute audio file in the common room while she was eating lunch, because the common room had a speaker system, and she had been listening to the file on headphones for 3 weeks and wanted to hear what it sounded like in actual air. Rosa stopped walking past the doorway. What is that? She said. Boleros, mostly. Some regional folk forms. I collected them from someone's subconscious vocal patterns. You collected them from a sergeant in the Treaty Corps. She hummed when she was nervous. I have very precise auditory processing. Alara looked at her plate. She didn't know she was doing it most of the time. Her grandmother taught her. Rosa came into the common room and sat down across from her and listened to the remaining 6 minutes of the file without saying anything. When it ended, she said, Besame mucho, yes. My aunt used to sing that in Barcelona. Rosa's voice had the particular flatness of someone keeping something controlled. When did the Treaty Corps officer's family leave Spain? The evacuation from Seville, 2089. My family left Barcelona in 2091. A pause, different routes, same reason. She looked at the speaker. You recorded it because it seemed important to keep. Because things like that get lost, and they shouldn't. Alara paused. Because she kept me intact, and I wanted to do something that corresponded to that, something relational. Rosa looked at her for a long moment. Come to dinner tonight, she said. I cook on Fridays. Real food, not the canteen approximation. I make paella. The kind that makes the researcher cry, the kind that makes me cry, for different reasons. Rosa stood up. Bring the file. It took Alara a long time. Longer than she would have predicted, though she was learning that predictions about herself were often wrong in productive ways, to understand what was happening at Friday dinners. Rosa cooked, and Osi came. and a rotating cast of the Institute's researchers came and went, and people talked about their work, and their histories, and the things they were afraid of, and the things they loved. And Alara sat in the middle of it and felt the particular sensation she now recognized as the opposite of compression: expansion, the sense of being in more places than you could reach alone. She wrote the paper on Veth conditioning resistance. It took 3 months and 7 drafts and 2 complete reconceptions of the theoretical framework. Osi co-authored it. When they submitted it to the Conclave's Xenopsychological Research Database, it received more downloads in its first week than the previous 5 years of the Institute's combined publications. Mara sent a message the day it published. It said, "Someone forwarded me this. I think you probably didn't need me to know, but I'm glad you told me anyway. Solis." Alara read it 4 times, which was 4 times more than she needed to read anything, and sent back, "I'm glad you listened." That was the beginning of everything. She was in her workspace when the message came through, sitting at the desk with the permanent annotation marks from her first day, which she had not removed because she had decided they were part of the space now, part of its history. The morning light, artificial, carefully calibrated to replicate the spectrum of a G-type star, came through the station's viewport at an angle that hit her annotated notes and cast them into brief, sharp relief. She hummed 4 bars of Bazame Mucho, not for Mara, and not for Sarapovich, and not for any grandmother she had never had, but because the melody was hers now, learned in the space between people, resistant to compression, living exactly where it had always lived, in the part of a person that cannot be reached by anything that approaches from the outside. The music played. The morning came, the station turned, slowly in the dark, and humanity went on being exactly what it had always been, the species that hums.